So it's great to be here. I'm Ray Middleton and I'm with Lucy Johnstone. Great to see you, Lucy.
Thank you for inviting me, Ray. I'm sure we're going to have an interesting chat today.
I deliver a 5-day training program or a workforce development program, and a significant chunk of that is the power threat meaning framework. And one of the things people find difficult to get their heads around often, or puzzling, is the idea of the patterns. And so that's what we're hoping to have a chat with you today, Lucy. So if we're going to try and talk through what the patterns are, what would be a good starting point?
You're right, Ray. Patterns are an aspect of the framework that are both very important and sometimes not very easy to understand. So I've had to think about this because it is very key. Interestingly, it's one of the things that we as co-authors of the framework struggled with most. So if we found it hard to get our heads around it, I'm not surprised that other people find it get their heads around it. So just to remind people what the patterns are. So the framework contains a number of core questions which are designed to work at a number of different levels, but probably most people use them to roughly construct or co-construct a personal narrative. But the framework also tries to outline broader patterns in distress which go beyond the individual, and they've got titles like surviving defeat, entrapment, disconnection and loss. That's one of them. And we've since developed some more patterns. They're on the website if anyone wants to have a look. So we now have a pattern called surviving spiritual crisis and one called surviving poverty. So what are they about? I've made a number of attempts to explain patterns, and there's always room. There's always room to spend more time unpicking it. And so I'm going to try and describe them in both a simple and a slightly more complicated way, starting with the simplest one first, if that's okay. So what are the patterns not? This is quite a common misunderstanding, I think, but actually the patterns are not new ways of labeling people or putting them in boxes or saying you belong to this pattern or something like that. So they're not a way of saying, you know, we used to call this psychosis, but now we call it surviving separation and identity crisis and confusion. So we're trying to get well away from diagnostic labels and categories in the framework. But I think it's quite hard to grasp that sometimes because all of us as a society are quite used to thinking in terms of neat boxes and neat categories. And so it's quite hard to see sometimes how the patterns are very, very different from that. So rather than a new set of boxes and labels to put on people or put people in, the patterns I think are best understood as very broad narratives. So you can have a personal narrative, of course, but you can also, we argue, have a very broad narrative that operates at the level of a whole society. And the personal narratives are always to some extent influenced by or shaped by the bigger narratives that are all around us, the meanings that operate in the level of a whole society. To take an example, we're thinking about a man who's lost his job and is feeling very kind of worthless and like a failure and so on. So his core feelings are about shame and failure. Well, it may be helpful him to realize by putting together a narrative that those are the roots of his feelings, but actually those beliefs and meanings that he's developed will also partly come from all around him. He will have received lots of messages about how men ought to be able to hold down jobs and support and so on. Suppose you have someone with a diagnosis of anorexia, let's say a young woman, she will have her personal narrative, but she will also, it'll be the case that her personal narrative is shaped by all the messages that are around us all in society. You know, to be thin is to be good. You know, there are pictures, there are images everywhere. So her story didn't come from nowhere. And suppose we have an example like a new mother who's struggling to cope with her young baby, very common situation, but she's likely to feel extra bad because we are surrounded by messages about how wonderful motherhood is and how much we love our babies the whole time, and magazine images of perfect families and so on. So the point I'm making is that our personal stories are bound to be shaped by the bigger stories and narratives around us, which are And all these messages, you know, how we should look, how we should feel, how we should behave, the kind of lives we should be living, and so on. And because everyone in a particular society at a particular time is on the receiving end of rather similar messages, to some extent our stories are bound to be similar, although they're never going to be absolutely identical between different people. So the general patterns is our attempt to outline what those bigger narratives and stories might look like. I hope that's making some kind of sense. And like everything else in the framework, this isn't just about people who may end up in services. It's about all of us. It's about all of us living in a given society, and all of us and the sense we make of our lives.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Lucy. I know it's a difficult thing. You know, I've struggled a bit to get my head around this as well. It's a difficult concept. So I think it's worth spending a bit of time people puzzling about this and thinking what does it mean, and talking about it, opening up a dialogue and kind of getting our heads around it. But that's really helpful. It reminded me I delivered some training on the framework to the perinatal mental health services in the northeast of England, and they talked about the young women who were pregnant or had a child watching social media a lot, and so they were looking into their culture, just kind of thinking about what I thought about when I heard you describe this, and then drawing on some of the narratives out there or some of the images or stories about motherhood and how easy it was, and some of the stuff on Instagram, and was kind of making it look, and then they were trying to make sense of it. So I suppose whether it's about being unemployed or about any kind of experience we have, we're not making our meaning or sense of it entirely in a bubble on the moon, in a vacuum, without any. We're tapping into those common stories and narratives, if I'm thinking along the right lines here with patterns. And we're not, although it feels like an individual journey to me in my life, when I try to make sense of it, I use language and the narratives and the common ideas. And some ideas are more dominant than others, and more likely, a bit like in the supermarket. Some stuff's on the low shelf and you just grab it. And some ideas are in our culture are further away. We might be less likely to grab these other stories. So I'm trying to make sense of an experience like around difficulties with food, or being a mum or a dad, or being unemployed, or any kind of experience like that. And the patterns are saying there are broad things out there, stories and narratives in our culture that we're going to draw on. Have I got that right?
Yeah, you have got it exactly right. Yes. So actually, I think in some ways, patterns isn't a very helpful word. I think that may be one of the reasons people have tended to think about patterns as something rather concrete. Narratives is a better word, isn't it?
Yeah, that does make sense. That's really interesting. I'm just wondering, Lucy, would you be able to give an example of this? Because it might help. Sometimes examples help to illustrate this. Would that be?
I will, yes. So general patterns, or perhaps general narratives, are all around us, like you say, and whether consciously or less consciously, we're all drawing on them. And we have a phrase in the framework saying meaning is both made and found. We make our own meanings, but our meanings come from all around us. So suppose we think of a particular person who is living in poverty, very common situation for many people in our society at the moment. And suppose, using the framework, they put together a personal story about feeling kind of trapped and worthless. Then the framework, we hope, can help them to see why they feel so trapped and worthless. It's not because they've suddenly developed a mental health disorder. They have very good reasons for feeling trapped and worthless. And making the link to their social circumstances will help to highlight that. But of course, they are not the only person living in poverty. We actually know, if you look at the evidence, a great deal about the impact of living in poverty. And not surprisingly, it's, devastating. So drawing on all this evidence and all this research, we have put together one of our recent patterns, which is called Surviving Poverty, which is summarising. And in some ways, this is absolute common sense, but we think it's worth spelling it out. It's summarising all the kind of power abuses you're subjected to if you haven't got enough money and enough resources, all the ways in which your lives will be affected, the threats, all the kind of threat responses likely to try and use. How do you survive this? And most importantly, the kind of feelings that you have about it. And the messages in our wider society may well be feelings about it's somehow your problem, you're feeling inadequate, you should be doing better in your life. In that case, a general pattern about poverty might help to show the person that their story is only a version of a much wider one in society.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So that's a good example, because if we link it to the earlier idea about patterns or narratives that are out in there, is if I'm struggling, and part of the difficulties I've got is that I'm surviving poverty, there'll be several different narratives in our culture to explain that. There'll be more than one story or narrative, and so what if I'm understanding this right, and tell me if I'm not getting it, Lucy, is the patterns is offering a way to think about how that experience might be, but it may be helping us to link it to how power operates in society, rather than there's something wrong, I'm a failure because I'm not very wealthy and have a high income.
Oh, absolutely. And it's the opposite of the individualizing. It's something to do with something in you, some lack of, I don't know, not trying hard enough or not working hard enough, something, the problem is in you. It's the opposite of the individualizing tendency.
Yeah. That's really valuable, I think. I really value that idea about trying to help people think a little bit more socially, or sometimes people might think of it like a social network perspective, which is, rather than it's just everything is my fault. I might, in my way of getting better, I might need to take responsibility for some things in my life and make some changes. But actually, it's trying to get away from this idea, because that might be paralyzing me. Is if I'm in a narrative where I think I'm a failure, I'm no good, and all those kind of negative individualistic narratives, a freeing process could be to think about, oh, am I in a pattern? I'm not the only person to have been feeling like this. Is it something to do with the fact that I'm living in poverty? In this example, there's lots of other things it could be, but we're using it to illustrate the point, aren't we? And so the pattern might be an offer to say that actually there's a narrative here that means there's, with a social explanation going on in this particular narrative, and tapping into ideas about power and how I might be feeling threatened, and how I might be responding to some of those threats that are aroused by poverty. And that might that's a way of making sense. So it's kind of offering a pattern or a narrative with a social perspective that helps us to think about power. Is that right?
I mean, that's a very good way of putting it. Like everything in the framework, it's about putting it in a bigger context.
Yeah, definitely.
So, there are various ways in which we hope that might be helpful to someone.
And and I was wondering, how might it be helpful then? If I kind of am off, if I think, oh, well, I could see this in a different a pattern or a narrative with a more social explanation about why I'm feeling and doing stuff, and it's I'm kind of articulating this thing out, but how might that be helpful to someone?
Well, as you know, everybody tends to feel a sense of relief when they realize it's not just me. I'm not the only one struggling this way. That's a universal feeling. And I mean, that's actually why some people welcome a diagnosis, I think. So a diagnosis can help to give the message, it's okay, it's not just you, and the person can feel relief, it's not my fault. Now, there are a number of problems with that from the PTM framework perspective. One is that diagnoses are not valid categories in our, as actually the people who draw up these manuals admitted themselves. So they're based on science, they're not based on evidence, and they come up with disadvantages like stigma and so on. The other problem we think is that even if you get a sense of relief, there's still a sense of, well, but it's something wrong with me, I can't help it because it's my illness and disorder. So it's kind of a way of blaming yourself, or being blamed, or at least having the problem located within you. So it seems to us, there are pros and cons, but actually we need to do a better job of explaining where people's difficulties come from. So we hope the framework can help to relieve a sense of guilt and shame and isolation in a different way by developing patterns that show that your story is actually part of the story of lots and lots of people. It's an understandable response to the difficult circumstances that many people are facing. In fact, your story is so common that, look, here we have a pattern that describes it. One other point I just want to briefly make while thinking about that, which is that the patterns are overlapping. There isn't a pattern that a particular person will find themselves fitting into. Lots of people will find that patterns describe themselves in a particular way, and this really isn't a way of saying I've now got a case of pattern number 3. It's a way of saying this is a resource that can inform my narrative, my personal narrative. This shows how my personal narrative can overlap with a more general narrative in society, and there may be several different patterns that people want to draw from. So again, right away for the sort of the box, put you in a box idea, so to speak.
So that's really helpful, Lucy, because I think that's one of the anxieties when I'm delivering the kind of workforce development program.
Yeah.
People are very warm and find the questions that the framework asks very helpful about how power is operated in your life, what powerful threats there might be, and what my threat response might be, rather than a symptom of a disorder. Is it an understandable threat response that I'm having, etc.? And they kind of create a narrative in themselves, asking and answering those questions, or help to build someone's personal narrative up. But then people have struggled or find a bit of anxiety about the offer of patterns. But the way you put that it helps to free up the thinking about it, that there'll be several overlapping patterns, and there'll be aspects
the patterns themselves don't have neat edges. They're loose, they're overlapping, they change.
They're loose and overlapping, and so there's space for it's not that maybe the anxiety is assuming a kind of that concern about the diagnostic approach, and then transferring that concern to the patterns, thinking, oh no, is this just we're trying to fit people into this?
Well, indeed, we're trying to get away from diagnostic.
And we're trying to get away from that, aren't we?
And yet it's so deeply embedded in all our minds, which is why we ourselves found it quite hard to come up with, well, what are these patterns? But actually they're meant to be as different as possible from the idea of putting people in boxes.
Yeah, that's really helpful.
True. I think it's also important to add that the framework isn't saying narratives are everything, language is everything. A strand of thinking that goes along those lines. But I mean, living in poverty, if we take that example, is a very real and difficult experience. So changing a narrative about what it means to living in poverty isn't going to make the poverty vanish. Of course it isn't. What it can do, we hope, is perhaps in a particular person's case, free them from some of the sense of shame and worthlessness that they may be carrying.
That's a good point, yeah.
And that if those meanings shift, they may feel more able to do something about their circumstances, even if that's limited in some ways. But also, if we understand the experience of living in poverty and the impact it can have at a broader social level, then as a society we'll be more inclined to actually deal with some of the root causes, which brings us on to some other possible uses of the patterns.
So Lucy, are there any other uses or usefulness that the patterns might have?
Well, we hope there are lots, but it's kind of early days. You know, the project's developing, the ideas are developing, as you know. So we've talked about how patterns might be useful from a kind of personal perspective. I mean, if we think about professionals and working with clients, as I did for many years in the mental health system, I think you can see how these general patterns or perhaps general narratives might be helpful for professionals who are thinking about, well, how do I understand the story of the person who is sitting in front of me? We don't want to take every person as the first example of any particular problem we've ever seen. As a professional, I certainly didn't find it helpful, and I never use the kind of patterns that were offered to me, like this person has bipolar disorder or this person has a personality disorder. That's a kind of narrative or pattern, isn't it? And not what stands up to scrutiny. So one of the things that always kind of puzzled me when I was working as a clinician was, well, I feel like I am drawing on some patterns, but they're not diagnostically based patterns because I don't believe in them. But I quite often find myself thinking something like, I wonder if this is another example of a young person who's struggling to kind of separate from their family, as many people do when in their country. Or I wonder if this is another example of a woman who's finding it quite hard to kind of assert herself and is feeling very trapped in her expected role. Without realizing it, I was sort of drawing on patterns. And actually, what I was doing was a kind of rather early version of constructing kind of patterns in my head, general narratives. So I think you can see how, psychologists particularly, but other professionals do use narrative-based understandings quite often. They use one-to-one formulations, but in a way, this is putting a bigger set of narratives round one-to-one formulations. It's saying, is there a whole set of stories that have quite a lot in common? So I think in that way, these general patterns could be helpful to clinicians. And if we think more broadly than that, if we had a whole mental health system, let's say, or welfare system or criminal justice system, based on an understanding that we're dealing with kind of patterns rather than kind of diagnostic pathways and labels, then I think the link between people's distress and their social circumstances would be much, much clearer. And I don't know exactly what that would look like in practice, but I'm confident it would look very, very different. And I'm pretty confident we'd be much better able to address the root causes of people's difficulties. And to take it a step further than that, there's been some interest in the framework from people working in public health. Now, suppose a public health approach, which wasn't based on, we're seeing rising tides of depression or whatever, but was based on understanding the patterns that operate at a level of a whole society, then we might have a rather different set of answers to questions like, why is knife crime increasing in some communities? Or, why is alcohol misuse increasing? And we wouldn't get kind of rather simplistic answers like we need more laws about carrying knives and more substance abuse services. We might need those things, but we would actually go beyond that to be able to think, I think, in a more sophisticated way about how do we understand these kind of threat responses, in a sense, in relation to what's going on at the whole societal level, which would involve looking at a kind of a bigger type of narrative and pattern. Is that making sense?
I think so. Yeah, it makes me think about, there's this idea about a paradigm shift. There's a very old book, the Structure of Scientific Revolutions, talks about paradigm shift.
Exactly.
I think Thomas Kuhn, if I can remember rightly. The essential difference, my understanding, the difference between the biomedical model of mental health and other approaches, narrative-based approaches of the is that the biomedical model feels the origin of the distress is within the person somehow, like the chemical imbalance theory or other alternative, you're disordered. And the alternatives would say you are having a physiological reaction, you might be feeling anxious or all sorts of different guilt, shame, etc. But the origins are social. There's things that have happened to you, or there's things going on currently, adversity, and there's some strengths that you've got and powerful things you can help you can access. But that's a more meaningful context, and that's why maybe the biomedical model has not succeeded for decades. But this is, then we need a paradigm shift would be the idea. I'm just checking if I've understood your explanation, Lucy.
You have, and we do need a paradigm shift. I will just say that we have not anywhere in the framework claimed that we have produced the paradigm shift. That's something that critics sometimes throw at us, how arrogant you are to say you've produced a paradigm shift. We haven't. We have certainly said we need one, and our most ambitious hope is that we, among many other people, can contribute some additional thoughts and steps towards achieving that. But that is actually what we need in the long term.
Right. Yeah, no, that makes sense. That makes sense. And so, did you want to say anything more about this more complicated kind of grasping of it?
I will. Yes, I will. So what we've said is that patterns that fit what goes wrong in our bodies don't fit so well in terms of what goes wrong in our lives. And if we think a little bit about what kind of different kind of pattern we need in order to understand what goes wrong in our lives, then the central thread we need to think about is not our biology and our knowledge of our biology, but actually it's about meanings. So at a personal level, what sense did you make of it is the thread, it's the central part of anybody's personal story. What meaning did you make of it? It's everything else hangs on that. Meanings about what happened to you helps to shape your understanding of it, your reactions to it, and so on. And meaning is also the central thread of the narratives that we've called general patterns. So that's Well, that is actually the fundamental difference, that, as you say, biology is involved, our bodies react to difficult life
Yeah,
experiences,
yeah.
but we're not talking about the very useful and, you know, supported by a lot of evidence patterns about what goes wrong in our body, which are based on biology. We're talking about a very different kind of pattern, which hangs together through the central thread of meanings. And by meanings, we need meanings at every level. I mean, our personal meanings, but as we've already discussed, those meanings also come from social meanings, from wider meanings in the context and the culture all around us. The meanings are the central thread. That is the central difference between the kind of patterns that work very well in most branches of medicine and work very poorly, I would say not at all, in psychiatry.
That's really interesting. Yeah, so with the meaning, so narrative approaches, one of the important things they have is the conversation, the dialogue about enriching someone's, helping someone co-create, co-edit their narrative. One of the things they talk about is, where do you focus on? So yeah. I suppose that word came to my mind when you're talking about, we're focusing here, we're saying a more helpful pattern might be to focus on meaning. What meaning are people making of their experiences of life? And that is probably a clue to why they're feeling distress, or why they're feeling other experiences they're having, or why they're behaving in a certain way, rather than focusing on what's, you know, is there a chemical imbalance inside me? Rather than focusing on the origins biologically inside me, internally, we're focusing on meaning instead, and we're saying, well, there are patterns out there, but this is a different pattern than looking for a biological origin of distress.
Yes, we're focusing on the personal meanings, but as we've already said, the personal meanings don't come from nowhere. So we're also, perhaps with the help of the patterns, looking at where those meanings come from more broadly. Yes.
Yeah, that's great. And patterns, thinking about it. Can you give an example of this to help people?
Well, if we think of return to one of the examples we used earlier, the let's say a man living in poverty, then as we've said, we could do a lot of useful exploration about the meanings he had attached to that, which are likely to do with kind of shame and worthlessness and failure and so on. But a general pattern would help him, we hope, to think that those meanings don't come from nowhere. They come from all the messages round about him, and that won't banish his poverty or anyone else's poverty. It might help him to make different meanings of his difficult experiences. And ditto with a clinician, the pattern might help the clinician to see that this person is, you know, struggling in very difficult circumstances, rather than needing some kind of label attached to them, and so on. So the patterns, we hope, are a resource to achieve this kind of fundamental shift, which is really a shift in thinking. And if change in thinking will affect almost everything else that, you know, that you do as an individual who's struggling, or someone who's working or supporting someone who's struggling.
That makes sense. So maybe my curiosity, my helpfulness I might be more helpful if I was in my kind of toolbox of helpful things, questions I might ask someone who I'm trying to be helpful. I could ask those general questions that the framework are based around, about how power's operating in your life. Well, I probably wouldn't use that phrase, you know, like I'd adapt it to land in the culture of the person I'm talking to, that it makes sense. I use a language that kind of resonates well in their world, I suppose.
Yes, and I think I would also say, if you're working with or supporting someone, you don't have to kind of, you know, get out some patterns and photocopy them and hand them out. I mean, it is about informing our whole way of thinking. So a pattern in your head, a bit like I described myself years ago, thinking, well, I am drawing on patterns, but I'm just not where they are. If those patterns in our head, that I hope are going to shape our whole way of thinking helpfully.
But I'm thinking this is a very different kind of pattern than the medical one, focusing on the meaning or sense we're making of it. But what happens if society changes? What about if meaning changes? You know, if society changes and we think differently about unemployment and employment, or we think differently about, you know, body image, what's attractive and thinness. So if society changes and it starts to think differently about these different categories, like attractiveness and not attractive, or unemployed and employed, and how we think about those groups, would that shift the pattern?
That's a very good question. They are, as you say, very different patterns. So yet another way of describing the difference is that the general patterns of the framework at some level describe what people do to survive, not necessarily consciously, not conditions that they have, like bipolar disorder or depression. What you do, not a condition you have. But you're right, because they are held together by meaning, based on meaning, kind of focused around meanings, and meanings happen at a level of whole society. If meanings in a society change, then the patterns will change. That's true. So that's another very big difference from medical patterns about what goes wrong in our bodies. So if you have malaria today, let's say, it's going to look pretty much the same as having malaria 100 years ago or 200 years ago or whatever. Yeah. But it's very different, as we know, actually, in expressions of various types of emotional and psychological distress. So these do change over time. Medical patterns don't have a very good way of explaining that. These are diseases and disorders. How does that happen?
You're saying that was a simple way to get us in there. Is there a more complex way of describing the general patterns?
Okay, so I'm now going to try and describe something that's a little more complicated, but equally important, I think, about what we're intending to do with the patterns, what they are, what they're meant to be there for, and how we hope they're developing. So, as you know, the framework has the very ambitious aim of showing what a complete replacement for the medical model on which psychiatry is based would look like. And this is because although the medical model has done an amazing job in, developing science and interventions and treatments for what goes wrong in our bodies over the last 100 years or so, when we apply that to what goes wrong in people's lives, it just doesn't seem to fit. And we've been told about a lot of things you could call patterns, like chemical imbalance, which actually turn out not to be true. Okay, so there are lots of examples of good practice which aren't based on diagnostic models. As we've already said, there's open dialogue, there's therapeutic communities, there's all sorts of good stuff out there. But our aim with the Power Threat Meaning framework, our very ambitious aim, was to go beyond particular models and outline a completely different set of principles which could support lots of different models, existing ones, perhaps future ones. Many of which are already very compatible with the principles of the framework. So that's why we don't describe the framework as a model as such, if you like. It's a set of principles that we hope underpins and supports a whole range of different models, and what they have in common is they're not based on diagnostic models of distress. So how do we do that? It was something we puzzled over for 5 years, I think. And I'm going to get a little bit technical here, but the medical model is actually based on patterns. That's not how we usually think of it. But suppose you go along to your GP and you say, I've got this experience of pain and a rash, and I'm losing weight, and I feel nauseous, and so on. Then the doctor will ideally be able to say that sounds like, that fits like a pattern, which we call diabetes. And he or she may run some tests, or it may fit the pattern of a particular kind of infection of some sort. And so after the tests have been done, the doctor may or may not be able to say, well, yes, I was right, this is diabetes, or this is an infection of some kind. Now, we don't call that identifying a pattern, we call that giving a diagnosis, but in fact what it is identifying a pattern that's based on a lot of medical evidence about what can go wrong in our bodies that might lead to particular kind of problems. And the field of medicine is based on many, many such patterns, which have been developed largely over the last 50, 100 years. I mean, obviously some of them are less clear-cut than others. There are still questions about some of the experiences people report, because fields of science are always developing, but essentially we have a very solid base of evidence-based knowledge about the patterns in our bodies. As we've already said, those particular kind of patterns don't seem to work when we're thinking about what goes wrong in our lives. So our central task in the framework, if we want to go beyond particular models, it was to think about, well, what might the patterns about what goes wrong in our lives look like? What might patterns of emotional suffering look like? And it's actually essential to come up with that if we want to get to where we want to be. And we're not saying we've got all the way there, of course, but we want to take a really big step towards not just a this, this particular therapeutic approach seems useful or whatever, but a completely different set of principles that will take us somewhere completely different, away, the jargon term is a paradigm shift, and we're not claiming to have produced a paradigm shift, but we do hope we've taken a step towards thinking very, very differently, fundamentally differently about all the ways we understand and support and try to offer healing in emotional distress. So that was our aim. And if I can make it slightly more complicated, the patterns that explain often very well what can go wrong in our bodies, as we've already said, are fundamentally based on research evidence about our biology, our bodies, what can work or not work in our bodies. But the conclusion we eventually came to was that the patterns which are suitable for describing psychological and emotional distress and emotional suffering are actually based on meaning. It's the thread of meaning that holds it all together. Now, obviously, our biology is involved. As we all know, events in our lives impact on our bodies as well as our minds. But what helps it all to hang together in PTM framework terms is the meanings, the personal meanings we ascribe to our experience, the meanings that we draw on from all around us as well. As we say in the framework, meaning is both made and found. The meanings that we are exposed to in our whole society, in our whole culture, the ideological meanings that feed into all of this. So we've developed this slightly complicated phrase of way of describing the patterns, which is they are patterns of embodied meaning-based threat responses to the operation of power. So you need all those bits. You need the power, you need the threat, you need the meaning, you need the threat responses. But the thing that hangs it all together in framework terms, the thing that makes it the kind of pattern that it is the thread of meaning. So I hope that makes some kind of sense. And of course, there are all sorts of implications following on from that, which is that meaning-based patterns are not going to give us the kind of cause-effect links that at least sometimes are quite clear in patterns based on biology. If you do certain things to someone's body or certain kinds of infection or certain kinds of injury, you could be pretty certain of certain kinds of outcome. But patterns based on meanings are necessarily going to be much looser in a sense. There aren't going to be clear cause-effect links. It isn't going to be the case that this happened to you and this is going to be the result. And actually that's, just how it is. That's a good thing. It allows room for sort of agency and choice and different outcomes. So the patterns are much less precise in many ways, but they are also much more appropriate for the kind of phenomena we're talking about. And one of the interesting implications of having patterns fundamentally based on meanings is that, of course, they're going to look very different across different cultures, because different cultures are based on different meanings, different assumptions, different social norms, different standards. So in that case, the patterns will change. Now, that's a very big difference from patterns in biology. Our bodies have worked more or less the same way for the 200,000 or so years that the human species has existed. Not so in terms of our societies, our cultures. We have had vastly different kind of cultures based on vastly different kind of principles, understandings, beliefs, assumptions, and meanings. So this is an interesting reflection on some of the things that diagnostic patterns, DSM, have struggled with. So what happens when you come across an expression of distress in a non-Western culture that looks very unusual, looks very different? The DSM has actually no clear way of understanding that, apart from saying, well, maybe this is an unusual form of schizophrenia that we only see in rural India or something like that. And what happens when you look back historically, the kind of hysteria that Victorian women were supposed to suffer from, for example, or, more recently than that, experiences like anorexia and self-harm were actually much less common. Why have they suddenly become more common? So diagnostic patterns don't have a very good way of explaining that. From the framework point of view, that makes absolute sense because meanings have changed. people's understanding the distress is just as real. The distress may be arising for other similar reasons, in fact, but the meanings that shape our distress would have changed, so the distress will look very different. And again, you know, that allows us to think creatively about ways of understanding that work very differently, but probably very appropriately in different cultures across the world. So the framework is really, really not about imposing Westernized kinds of meanings on non-Western cultures. We are not trying to export the framework worldwide, but we are taking a position that all societies and all cultures are bound to develop their own, to some extent, unique and local versions of distress and ways that it manifests and ways that it can be understood. And from a framework point of view, we need to adopt a degree of humility, really, in learning about those, working alongside them, supporting each other, if you like, across cultures, rather than seeking to impose a diagnostic model that really hasn't worked very well in Western societies at all, and probably works even less well cross-culturally.
Maybe it's harder work, I'm suggesting, to have a pattern that's helping people to make sense of their life, rather than harder than a biomedical model, even though it's not evidence-based or true or valid. It's attractive. What do you think of that idea? Is it's not, it offers a little bit more uncertainty. We need to tolerate a bit more uncertainty. If we're going to have a pattern, a power threat meaning framework pattern kind of approach.
Well, I mean, everything you said is true. We all want a simple answer. I would love to have simple answers to some of the struggles that I face, you know. But I mean, actually, simple answers that aren't true and aren't based on evidence don't ultimately get us anywhere. And that's
exactly.
where people do get burnt out. They can see that people aren't changing. It's where people themselves get stuck and feel increasingly powerless. So we are absolutely not claiming that this is a simple answer. It's not. And actually, emotional suffering doesn't have neat packages. The answers come in neat packages. If we talk about patterns that are fundamentally held together by meaning, we're not talking about nice, neat cause and effect links. You know, living in poverty, for example, experiencing abuse does not necessarily result in this, or this outcome. But actually, turn that on its head, that is good. That is to be welcomed. That shows that nothing is fixed. That shows that people can that shows that people can develop their new narratives. That shows that people can go on with the lives they want. We have guides in the form of the patterns and the stories that people tell about themselves. They're not determined. They're always open to change. We do have to live with a degree of uncertainty and humility. But anything is better than a simple wrong answer. And a more complex set of tools and ideas that would actually help people to get where they need to be is, I think, what we hope the framework offers.
Thanks, Lucy, for your time. Don't forget, there's the Power Threat Meaning Framework. Straightforward introduction to it is a good read if anyone's interested. So thanks a lot, Lucy.
Thank you.